foreign aid, what's broken about it, and how can one small, intrepid startup think tank change the way that hundreds of billions of dollars are spent around the world for good? Walter Kerr is the executive director and co-founder of Unlock Aid. He's a former FSO who hung out in the good old days in Chengdu for a little bit, as well as Amanda Arch, chief operating officer of Unlock Aid, a Microsoft veteran and founder of Kasha, a fintech platform in Africa, are both on the podcast today to talk about their new think tank. So, what is foreign aid, and how much does America spend on it?
So foreign aid, first of all, Jordan, thanks for having us. Foreign aid refers to the tens of billions of dollars that the global community spends every year to address challenges like global health security, food insecurity, education, and other global priorities. The United States, through the U.S. Agency for International Development, spends more than any other global development agency around the world, more than $30 billion a year. And the idea is that by investing in and helping to build healthy societies around the world, that by investing in programs like food, education, health, et cetera, that collectively could build a more prosperous, healthy world, less likely to go to conflict, more likely to save lives, and ultimately, benefit the planet.
And let's talk dollar amounts for a second.
So the United States spends more than $30 billion every year on foreign aid. This year, it will spend the vast majority of that through the U.S. Agency for International Development, although there are a couple of other big U.S. global development agencies and programs. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is one, the Development Finance Corporation is another, and then there are kind of signature foreign aid programs like PEPFAR, which are singularly focused on issues like HIV.
Seems great. What's wrong with it?
Well, I think the first challenge is that not enough of this foreign aid money actually reaches anything foreign. And so, depending on how you define what it is to be a local entity or a foreign entity, anything between 7 to 11% of U.S. foreign aid actually reaches a local organization or a foreign organization. In fact, the vast majority of it flows through just a handful of large, often U.S.-based government contractors. And then even there's a big consolidation problem where around 60% of funding, actually more than that, goes through just 25 government contractors. 75% of funding goes to just 80. And the impact this ends up having, though, is that organizations that are closest to solving the problems can't access the funding they need to ultimately invest in breakthrough technologies related to addressing climate change or global hunger. And really what we're thinking about is, how do we create new pathways that enable these really next generation organizations with some of the most compelling solutions for the climate crisis, for addressing food insecurity, global health security, to be able to access that funding to scale up solutions that we know will have an impact and save lives.
So I want to come back to this idea of like big is bad. We had Tyler Cowen on the podcast a few weeks ago who wrote Big Business, a love letter to an American anti-hero. Microsoft a few weeks ago, sort of like the biggest bad in the land, is now about to roll out this like incredible AI innovation with Copilot. That's going to mean I'm never going to have to make a PowerPoint presentation again. What fails with scale when it comes to development around the world?
Well, I think it's not. I would say that it isn't scale that maybe is a challenge. I think what we're saying is that because there's such a concentration of the organizations who have been doing this work for a long period of time, and so much of the funding is going to a handful of players, that we're really about diversification of new players coming into the space. And so we think that it is important to be able to have elements of scale in terms of the best evidence-backed proven solutions, be able to maximize their impact. That is a good thing in terms of the results that we want to see. I think that right now, because where we are in terms of on pace to achieve the sustainable development goals, we know that we need new solutions and the opportunity for them to participate. Right now, they're being blocked out of being able to access the funding. And that's what we're focused on, is the diversification of partners to be able to scale and to achieve more impact.
Yeah, I was going to say that if you were to look out across the countries where, U.S. foreign aid historically has supported in Asia, Africa, Latin America, over the last 60 years or so, there's been this explosion of new organizations that have grown up that are really solving problems related to health, food, education. These organizations don't think of themselves as global development or international development organizations. They're just a healthcare company, or they're a logistics provider, or they're an agricultural provider. I think what we are trying to do is to help bridge the gap between where foreign aid has traditionally flown, which is to a handful of largely legacy contractors that have built their businesses around the business of winning U.S. government grants and contracts, and helping to connect resources to these other organizations that are really already having an impact on the ground. Now we just need to scale up that impact so that we can get greater bang for our buck and ultimately save more lives.
The analogy that strikes me as like most relevant to this, as opposed to like tech monopolies, is defense contractors. And it's just, it's a difficult thing to get to the level where you are legible to any sort of like government granting or contracting organization. And there are, and the sort of incentives that lead to concentration in the defense world, as well as I assume in the USAID world, is this idea of like, we just need to get money, like sort of budgetary constraints of like getting money as out as fast as possible, and making mistakes and taking errors and being risk avoidant. There aren't sort of like I don't think anyone at USAID is working on a sort of like VC style compensation package where if they fund something that's like 100x better than the last thing, then they're going to be rewarded for taking on that sort of portfolio risk.
That's such a great point. I mean, so much of this is just the cultural change that's needed in terms of how our public institutions are thinking about this risk-reward trade-off to doing more innovative approaches to their goals and missions. And so from our perspective, we're not ever advocating for, completely turning the ship and doing everything differently. I think we're looking, as Walter said, to, how can we ensure that there are reasonable pathways for innovators to start working with the agency so we can start to get the data and evidence to continue to invest further into these types of solutions, and so that we feel like we're trying new things, we're doing it at a reasonable scale to be able to further accelerate it.
Jordan, when I think about kind of what we're trying to do with Unlock Aid, it's, in many ways, this is a campaign to modernize the way that government works, starting with U.S. foreign aid, because a lot of the challenges that we're talking about around consolidation, not getting enough results for the investments we make, these are analogies that are true across the federal government. Other federal agencies are struggling to keep up with the pace of the 21st century. And so much of the thesis here is that there's already been loads of research, loads of resources poured into figuring out what investments are most likely to have the highest impacts in terms of lives saved or dollars saved. Now, how do we create the incentives? How do we address the procurement barriers? How do we address a lot of the sludge that keeps government investments from flowing to those interventions and solutions that we know are going to have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare, education, other places where lots of money gets spent, probably in not the most efficient way. But I guess is a slightly different sort of balance of power than the development primes that you guys are trying to force to work in different ways. How can we fix this? What are some of your ideas of how to change these processes?
Jordan, I think that a lot of the ideas out there are to look across the federal government and other public institutions, look at what's worked, and then say, well, why don't we try to adapt this in a U.S. foreign aid context as well? So one specific idea is the idea of scaling proven solutions. So we have invested a lot of money, collectively, in terms of identifying what are the interventions, the programs, innovation solutions, whatever word you want to use, that we know is going to, per dollar spent, yield the most social impact in terms of lives saved, in terms of dollars saved. We should be looking at this list of solutions and making sure that they are first in line to receive funding. Right now, the way that the federal government and USAID traditionally tends to think about these kinds of typically newer approaches to solving programs is to fund them through smaller innovation budgets. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars. Instead, what we should be doing is looking at what are these programs that are yielding the highest return on investment and funding them out of the general account where we can bring them to scale, so that we're not talking about using these interventions in just a geography here or a community there, but really on a national scale. to save the most lives possible. So having some kind of codified proven solutions program where we are prioritizing those most cost-effective interventions, I think is one idea. A second is just re-looking at a lot of the ways that we're getting money out the door so that we flip the model on its head, including by paying for outcomes instead of for programs. Right now, the way that the federal government tends to pay for a lot of global development programs is they say, we've got this big problem that we want to solve in health. We're going to spend $100 million and everybody send us your proposals about how it is that you think you would address this challenge. When we do that, that optimizes for who can put together the best proposal and ultimately who has built the most expertise in terms of winning a government grant or contract. If instead we flip this and we said the US government wants to pay X amount of dollars per a particular outcome, and we will pay retroactively once we see that outcome or result has been delivered, this would flip the model such that we're not optimizing for proposals, we're optimizing for results. It engenders more innovation because the thing that we're paying for, the way that we're getting accountability is whether we actually got the end result. And so just by looking at things like innovative procurement models and shifting how we're getting money out the door can incentivize better performance, bring down costs, cut red tape, and ultimately save more lives.
Two thoughts, Walter. One, it took an immense amount of work for the US government to even start experimenting with pay for performance when in the healthcare context. So, I guess, again, it's the political economy question. Like, are there enough people lobbying against this who know that they can't compete with the happy local player who is probably way more efficient than the sort of giant firm which is paying first world salaries? I don't know. We'll see. I hope that ends up playing out. The other sort of like random take was my hope that sort of the edge that you get in grant writing is something that AI is very quickly going to dissipate. If everyone, without native level English, without a ton of context, can ask GPT-4, hey, like, please, here is my company, search all the data, like, here's 5 bullet points I want you to hit. Please turn this into something that a US aid grant administrator would be impressed by. My hope is that some of this like institutional overhead and bloat, not just in foreign aid, but like across government contracting, may end up being the sort of like financial and knowledge sort of institutional barriers to this may end up being sort of ameliorated somewhat by AI. Though then again, I'm sure there is an aspect of this which is also very much relationship driven, which prettier, more like better formatted prompts aren't necessarily going to solve.
For sure. And just to say that, I think that we think that there's so much elements of complexity benefiting the incumbents. And so in terms of just how ChatGPT and these things can help reduce barriers to ensure that those particular elements of just familiarity with the process, just how much time and investment is needed for small innovators to be able to meaningfully bid for some of these awards. I think, also looking at transparency, just ensuring of end to end, how are we spending this money? What are the results that are happening? I think really the transparency in some of our policy proposals there ensures that we have a better aperture of end to end, what is happening, how can we improve, and that better fosters the culture of innovation that we want to see at our public institution, where we can have honest conversations about what's working, what's not, who are the best people to be able to solve these solutions.
By transparency, it's like making clear to the taxpayer like the cost structures, as well as making sure that everything has like after action report of sorts of how much how effective the program was. I mean, there must be some of that already now, no?
So, Jordan, I think one of the things that we think is important is transparency, because even this question about how much money is getting to foreign local entities is actually hard to know, because the data that USAID uses to publish this information is not publicly available. They use internal systems that the public doesn't have access to. So it's difficult to replicate their own statements about how much money is reaching local organizations. But even if we were going to look at something like how much money flows from one of the larger international contractors to local entities, because we don't have information about what indirect rates are and management costs, et cetera. It's very hard to actually know how much of this money gets stuck in the DC Beltway and how much money is actually going to improve outcomes around the world. To the administration's credit, Administrator Samantha Power, former U.S. UN ambassador, I think she does get it that we need to get more of these resources to organizations on the front lines solving problems. It's one of the reasons why she's made a pledge to get at least 25% of USAID funding directly to local organizations, one of the signature things she hopes to achieve by the end of this administration. But I think she's also coming up against really serious, big bureaucratic challenges to making that happen. They've got a lot of money they need to spend with a limited amount of time, with relatively few people on staff. So that favors the mega award model with $100 million, $200 million awards, of which there are only a handful of contractors in the world set up to absorb this funding. So we think a mix of a lot of the internal de-sludging efforts that the administration is actually undertaking on its own to reduce the transaction costs of getting this money out the door, plus a lot of the innovative procurement vehicles that we've been advocating an increase in use of that optimize for results instead of for proposal writing, plus some other pathways that create dedicated funding to bring to scale those interventions that we know are likely to yield the best results. Taken together, we think that all of these things can ultimately transform the way that we administer U.S. foreign aid, make it far more effective, and actually in the process, establish the U.S. as the partner of first resort for countries around the world that want to access this kind of funding, technology, innovation to accelerate social and economic development progress.
What's so upsetting about that story you just told, Walter, is like these are not, the government's the only buyer here. Like they can make the rules, and these are not classified programs where anything in the procurement documents are going to be like revealing state secrets. I can't find any reason why the sort of like entirety of what these businesses do shouldn't be in the public domain. Or am I missing something? I don't know. What's the argument you guys run into?
Well, I mean, the main argument we run into is that the contractors will say, well, this is competitive information. What is our indirect rate versus what is your indirect rate, which is another way of saying, what is our management fee for managing all this money is considered trade sensitive. And if we made that public, then it would hurt our ability to win a contract relative to this other government contractor. There are a handful of instances where I do think it actually probably is important to keep some of the information more close hold. If we are funding an NGO in Syria, for example, that might be targeted by an authoritarian regime, it makes sense why we would want to keep some of that information away from or shield it to some extent from public view. But there's a lot that we can do to put a much greater sunlight in terms of how foreign aid dollars are spent, in part because we think that the more sunlight there is on foreign aid, the more pressure there will be to actually get resources out the door to organizations best positioned to have an impact.
It's so funny because like in so many places where there's this like big question of like what should the government do to impact corporate behavior, like the government isn't the 800-pound gorilla that it used to be, for instance, with semiconductors, where it could really dictate the development of the industry because it ended up buying 97% of the chips. Like these companies, they're not going to go to anywhere else, really. It's like, I mean, I guess you can go to like Japan or the UK or the Netherlands and like ask them to fund your development stuff. But these companies are still going to be bidding for whatever USAID ends up putting out there as for their tenders. And the irony is like there's an extraordinary amount of leverage that the government has if it can sort of figure out its internal processes in order to not have to be reliant on these large firms to spend the money that's appropriated to them.
The other thing about all of this is that the world in 2023 looks very different than it did in the 1960s when we started doing U.S. foreign aid in the first place. Right now, just as a very simple example, there's a $17 billion global health supply chain contract that's up for public tender. It's the largest foreign aid contract or set of contracts the agency has ever put up. There is a firm in Africa called M Pharma. It's the largest pharmacy on the continent, operates across 9 countries. It sees people every day, gives them anti-malarials, HIV tests, you name it. To date, they have yet to receive a single dollar from this large global health supply chain contract. This is a continuation of a $10.5 billion award before that, a $2.5 billion award before that. When we're talking about how do you have the most impact, working with an organization like that, the largest pharmacy chain in Africa, helping them scale up their impact, paying them to expand access to antimalarials, HIV tests, is the most cost-effective, fastest, highest impact way that we can be distributing foreign aid. If we had more transparency around how much money was flowing to which organizations to do what, I think it would create enormous pressure on policymakers to ensure that more funding is actually flowing to those organizations that are best positioned to have the most impact.
And just to add on to that, I feel like it's not only the transparency of how the money is flowing, we also this is where the power of narrative shift is so critical, because we do need to ensure that our legislators and, just the broader public has an understanding of what solutions and what's possible on the ground today. So I think there's an element of our work that is shining a light on these types of solutions, being able to share their impact in action. I think we'd love to, be able to do a CODIL or a staff DIL at some point where we're really taking legislators on the journey to see what's happening on the ground today, because I think that's really where those eye-opening moments are of like this whole new world is possible that we're not in on. Because if you just look at right now, maybe what some of the missions are funding locally on the ground versus what's happening across the street and some of the innovation ecosystems being built in places like Accra and Nairobi and Bogota, et cetera. I mean, this is where we need to be able to close that gap of how we're currently funding things and what's possible in these innovation ecosystems.
That's really interesting, that the sort of like there's like some like bigotry of low expectations going on when it comes to these local players that the rest of the world hasn't the developed world hasn't necessarily caught up with.
In some cases, I mean, there's technology that's been developed in Africa, Latin America, Asia, that's a decade ahead of what we're doing here in the United States. Mobile money, Kenya was way ahead of us in terms of Venmo by deploying technology like M-Pesa. And, there's examples like that across the board where companies, nonprofits are developing highly innovative solutions to solving challenges that are unique to their local conditions that are outpacing even what we've done in the United States or in Europe. And the solution often is to scale up those kinds of investments rather than hoping that we can fly in folks from overseas to dream up solutions for them. There's a group, Jordan, called NEPI, which is worth looking into. They've had such an effective cognitive behavioral therapy approach to reducing violence in Monrovia in Liberia by getting at-risk youth who are in jeopardy of joining gangs to get involved with, the particular way that they've done their programming. And it's had a significant impact in terms of reducing crime in Monrovia. It's been so successful that now Chicago is replicating this.
There's like a nice version of this, Walter, where you get a sort of like competitive development dynamic where like China and the US are competing to like make the rest of the world richer, which is sort of like the most hopeful story I could possibly tell about the trajectory of US-China relations. I'm curious, to what extent you see, like, is AIIB and other sort of Chinese development efforts like at all interested in this sort of game? I mean, I guess the sort of stereotype is like you're flying out sort of like people who make is like you just end up having like folks from Anhui building railroads in Kenya as opposed to having a more sort of integrated approach like the ones you guys just described.
I think that the United States is never going to go dollar for dollar with China in terms of what it's spending on Belt and Road. Having said that, though, if we were to actually think about what is the United States' comparative advantage insofar as it relates to positioning the United States as the partner of first resort for countries around the world, we really still do have an edge when it comes to innovation, technology, and helping countries access and scale up the use of innovation and technology to solve hard problems. To date, I don't think that the way that we've thought about U.S. foreign aid has really leaned into innovation as a real strength of ours, that we can really think about scaling up. To the extent that we've had investments in innovation, it's typically tended to be very small ball, $10 million here, $10 million there, not touching the $30 billion that the Agency for International Development is spending each year. And so I think, so many of the policy prescriptions that we're talking about with Congress, with USAID, is really about this idea of how do we look at the technologies, the innovations and solutions that we know through trials, through demonstration of commercial viability, through outside evaluations, have an outsized impact, are saving the most lives, are cost effective, and then really bring them to scale. If we are able to partner with countries and help them access and scale up these kinds of solutions, I do think that there is a way that we can help the United States become really a partner of first resort for so many countries around the world. But that will require moving away from a model that often means flying in international contractors from the DC Beltway to then come in, choose their own partners, figure out how they want to solve the problem. We really need to be moving much more to a partnership model where we're helping countries access the kinds of technologies and solutions they need and they want to accelerate their own development and economic progress.
And just to add there, Walter, I think, not only do we need to be helping countries pick the best solutions and innovations that make the most sense, for where they're at on their development journey, I also think we need to look at, they are actively building out their own innovation ecosystems, thinking about how to build jobs for the future of citizens of their countries. And I think that the United States can really be helping them think of what are these leapfrog technologies? What does this mean for their workforce development and where they want to go in terms of their country's journeys to being part of the, the jobs and industries of the future as well, that are not so heavily reliant maybe on manufacturing and industrial revolution jobs.
So tell me a little more about Unlock Aid. How are, what is the ground strategy for sort of realizing these changes we've talked about over the past half hour?
So Unlock Aid has been around for a little over a year. We started with 9 organizations who really felt like we were in a unique moment to try to push some reforms possible. I think about why I was excited to join Unlock Aid in 2021. I felt like, there's been so many challenges that we've all been aware of in this sector for a long time. And so when I met Walter, he had helped to put together this research project, really looking at a lot of the barriers. It actually started with this article that he published in Foreign Affairs on on how procurement reform is really blocking a lot of the changes that we need to see in this space. And I like to say that was kind of this lighthouse moment for me where I was like, yes, that is exactly a root cause issue that we need to advance so much of the innovations that we want to see forward. And so when I met Walter, saw that he had this, been able to bring together 9 organizations that were committed to putting together this initial level policy, I think in our wildest dream, we were like, okay, maybe we can take this to DC. Maybe we can find some people that would be open to some legislators who would be open to talking about this. But in our wildest dream, it would be, could we maybe get some legislation introduced? And so over the course of last year, we had our initial DC Advocacy Week where we were blown away by the level of engagement and support we were hearing from bipartisan legislators in terms of our initial policy asks. And during that week last year, a senator who works in foreign affairs said to us, I love what you guys are thinking, but we need to think bigger. This is a really unique window we have right now to do some big things in terms of modernizing foreign assistance. And we think that you guys have got some great ideas, but how can we really take this and be more transformative? And so this led us to putting together an event we did in Mexico City last summer called the SDGs Moonshot Accelerator, where we went out to our community of innovators in our coalition and said, okay, if you were given $500 million to be able to maximize your impact, what would you do with that? What would be some of the policy support that you would need? What are the resources that you would need to be successful? And this, we feel like, was the first time that there was a flip asking the frontline innovators what they would do with a significant amount of funding to achieve impact. So through that process, we went to Mexico City. We had 70 plus organizations representing 35 countries come together. We were working with the Federation of American Scientists Day One project on these proposals. And we were able to put together some really exciting moonshot ideas. And through this process, has helped us to further strengthen our policy platform to put forward what we feel like is a really bold, ambitious agenda in terms of reimagining global development. This is what we've now worked to strengthen in terms of our legislative asks. And we were thrilled to see, elements of these ideas that were included in the bipartisan Fostering Innovation and Global Development in December of last year. That was introduced by Representatives Castro and Representatives Kim. And we're looking forward to now in this new Congress being able to see more of this get over the finish line.
Jordan, if I were to add to that, I think that what's been exciting about so many of the policy prescriptions, ideas that we put forward is that, Unlock Aid is a coalition first. It's a coalition of organizations who are on the front lines of solving these problems. And so much of the ideas that we put forward have really been driven from questions with them to say, what are the barriers that are keeping you from being able to access public funding to scale your impact? And then from that, we've been able to translate it in many ways and for policymakers to understand, okay, if we wanted to work with organization X or organization Y, we need to address procurement barrier A and create pathway to funding B. This initially started as a research project. There were a handful of us that were involved with talking to 70 plus organizations to identify what were those biggest barriers. And it's really evolved since then to now what feels like a movement. And we're really encouraged. The administration recently put out its new acquisitions and assistance strategy that's talked about diversifying the agency's partner base, getting more funding to local organizations, scaling up the use of pay for performance as the most important metrics that it's going to be using to evaluate success and progress. We're seeing the introduction of legislation. So it really does feel like now is a very special opportunity where we have a narrow window to actually drive through a lot of these reforms. It's one thing to have the policies put out there. Now it's going to come down to implementation.
So Walter, compare the sort of ideas that you've been pushing, particularly with what you guys got up to at Mexico City, with the sort of givewell.org approach.
There are a lot of organizations out there that have already put in tens of thousands of hours, sometimes in the case of an organization like GiveWell, to identify what are the specific charities, NGOs, interventions that we know per dollar spent are going to yield the highest impact in terms of lives saved per dollar. And so much of the idea around proven solutions, which we talked about at the beginning of the show, is to say, how do we look at these kinds of investments and make sure that those that have the highest ROI are first in line to receive funding and create real pathways to bring to scale the most effective programs in global development.
Beyond GiveWell and malaria and bed nets, there's also this searching function that kind of needs to happen in order to be able to find the next, super awesome, effective approach. What is or isn't happening or needs to happen in this space to make sure that we're sort of not stuck in a lower equilibrium than we necessarily could be when it comes to effectiveness of the interventions?
I mean, I think we feel that there is, extensive, research and development, kind of early phase support for very compelling solutions in global development. And so we see a lot of, $250,000 pilots, in country X, testing out solution Y. I think what we feel when we think of effectiveness is really the biggest gap that we have to finding this next phase of solutions is when we see after organizations have kind of proven out some proof points and now they're looking for this next level of scale, where we're really going to maybe in terms of an organization that's looking to do delivery of certain inputs, when they're in a pilot, they're in a certain cost structure and, limiting their impact, that they really need to get to this next level of scale to showcase, the full fidelity of the solution. And so I think from our perspective, what's needed is how are we identifying solutions that are kind of at this breakout stage where they've seen the early results, they have the traction. Now they need to scale up to the next level where they maybe go from serving 100,000 people to 10 million people. And that's where we feel like in the global development pipeline, there's the biggest gap today in terms of the funding and resources necessary to scale up to that next level. So we feel great that there are parts of USAID, even within the development innovation ventures, that has an expertise of validating and proving out the evidence and the hypothesis for early stage solutions. I think, as we said earlier, some of our core policy goals is what would it look like to take those evidence-backed proven solutions and being able to ensure that they have access to the scale of funding to go from 1 country to 5 countries, 10,000 people to 5 million people. That's where we feel the biggest opportunity right now for those next most effective solutions to be found.
There's a program at a lot of other federal agencies. I think 11 federal agencies have the Small Business Innovation Research Program, which has basically a phased funding model where you can come in with a solution and receive a $150,000 grant. If it proves effective, they'll increase the grant size to, let's say, $250,000 or $1 million. It kind of varies depending on the agency. If that proves effective, though, then you get to flip and access the general account to bring your solution to scale. This kind of program does not really exist in global development. It exists in some ways, but it does not exist around commercializable, sustainable solutions. So much of what we see in global development, especially in certain sectors like health, power, food, is that there actually are very commercializable solutions that have long-term sustainable, highly innovative ways of solving big challenges, but there's not been a nexus for bringing those kinds of solutions to scale. So another policy idea that we put forward also is, what would it look like if we had an SBIR-like program for global development? We're actually building long-term sustainable, commercializable technologies and solutions for big global development challenges with eligibility for organizations based in low and middle income countries to apply.
Sorry. So by commercializable, it's like the government's uncomfortable funding businesses that can self-sustain. Is that the concern right now?
I don't think the government at large is uncomfortable funding businesses. I think that from a development context, it's being able to say, what are the most effective interventions versus and being able to scale up those interventions where we already see a lot of this evidence versus when is there a moment where one specific organization has an expertise that we need to scale up in terms of their technical capacity, their operation support to be able to enter and serve additional markets and reach more people to ultimately maximize their impact. And I think it just having both pathways to be able to scale up different parts of the development toolkits.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of like scary and sad. You guys are talking about cyber as a model after like all the shows I've done about how it's like terrible in the DoD context, and all of these companies get like stuck at phase 2 and never end up reaching graduating to the big pots. But hopefully the dynamic is ends up being a little different once that comes to your neck of the woods.
But, I think we have the benefit of seeing the challenge that a lot of SBIR models have had with other federal government. In some ways, like that's been the pilot. And now it's, we get to say, okay, if we got to apply this in a global development context, what's needed? And, there are some effective SBIR programs out there that have effectively made the link between phase 2 and phase 3 funding. And that's a component of what we would need to see if we were going to have a similar kind of program function in a global development context.
And Jordan, I think that's, I love that you said that, because I think that one of the things that we hope in terms of the work we're doing at USAID is also not to have this feel like so siloed across agencies. And we just want innovative models across the government to be actually closer working together, and we're faster sharing some of the best practices and learnings about how it is that we need to scale up innovative solutions. And so I think our ultimate hope is that through whatever breakthroughs we're able to have with this, that we are replicating and sharing faster insights across all agencies on what's required for innovation to be successful.
We spent basically this whole episode talking about the U.S. context, but we got Germany with a casual 25 billion, the UK 20 billion, the EU, God knows how terrible their procurement process is, at 17 billion, Japan, France. There's lots of other governments that are spending real money to try to, create positive development impacts around the world. So how is this conversation playing out in other countries? And, what's the hope, can unlock more than just, Washington.
Well, so I think the first thing to know is that other governments, I think, address similar kinds of challenges. They are accountable to their taxpayers, and so they have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that taxpayer dollars are well spent. Other governments do a better job in general of getting more resources directly to organizations closer to solving the problems. This isn't to say everybody's doing a great job at this, but other entities like the Norwegians, like the Dutch, have done a pretty good job at getting resources directly to organizations on the front lines of solving problems. There's a lot of multilateral institutions that are also doing a pretty good job as well, like the Global Fund, like Gavi, in terms of getting more resources directly to organizations on the front lines of solving problems. So there are models that we can replicate and still have high impact and maintain a level of fiduciary responsibility to the U.S. taxpayer. Having said all of that, though, so many of the international foreign aid donors look to the United States. And so if we are able to make some progress here in a big way, this will have ripple effects across the G7 and with other large international aid donors. So even moving from 7 to 11% up to 25% is going to have a cascading effect across the international development ecosystem because this challenge of moving more resources to more effective organizations is one that all sorts of donors are grappling with and are looking for models they can replicate as well.
One thing we hear often from organizations who are for-profit and have some element of potentially venture funding is that because today it's so hard for innovators to be able to access the scale of funding directly with USAID or as a subcontractor, their investors are saying, we need to grow, we need to continue to achieve our business goals. If there's no meaningful path and, reasonable timelines, this doesn't make sense in terms of how an organization should be spending its time, even if it's the most impact aligned organization out there. And so I think we feel that in terms of other ripple effects that we could see, if we can show organizations that there is a faster, more reliable pathway to be able to scale their impact and grow their organization with public institutions like USAID, we feel like this could unlock a lot of other investment in Silicon Valley with other private sector investors to want to crowd in more investment into the global development space. There's billions of dollars out there right now that, if even 1% of that was able to meaningfully shift to innovative solutions, this could unlock a lot more investment.
Yeah. Coming back to the sort of DoD analogy as well, like defense tech was not cool for a really long time. But, just in the past few years, thanks to the war in Ukraine and like increased US-China tensions, there's been a lot more, and like, one or two successes with Palantir and Anduril, there's been a lot more excitement for folks who aren't necessarily just like, values players trying to get into the space to think in that, that yes, they can feel good about themselves, but they can also make a profit that they can go back and tell their LPs was sort of worth their time and money. And if the development world can get to that space, that would be a really exciting place that that would be a really awesome kind of validator. The sort of procurement has really gotten to a point that new entrants are excited to bring the latest and greatest.
The reason why we called it the Moonshot Accelerator, this event that we did in Mexico City, is I think we really do see this broader work we need to do in development to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, ensure we're on track to hit core climate targets by 2030. We do need, this is an all hands on deck situation. We need the best innovators there. And so I think in terms of really being able to get the best talent, the best resources, the best solution, the most excited about contributing their time and efforts into building solutions for this space, that's what we hope that we're able to help unlock and be able to catalyze more investment and resources to these critical challenges.
Well, Walter and Amanda, I hope to have you guys back on in 3 years after you've closed your first $500 million round to invest in seed development startups around the world. But in the meantime, I just want to make a case for all the philanthropists, all the effective philanthropists around the world to give you guys money right now. So currently your budget is just $1 million a year. And speaking of like potential ROI, the work that Unlock Aid is doing to potentially like dramatically reshape the way that tens of billions, if not potentially hundreds of billions of dollars of development aid is spent around the world to drive it to more cost effective, impactful solutions is a really exciting way that I think, if you do the sort of expected value back out of the, chances you guys have for success is compelling. I think the sort of logic that ends up with folks giving money to bed nets is totally understandable. It makes a lot of sense that you'd want to have a high degree of confidence that your money is doing good in the world. But on the other hand, if you're looking at like expected value, placing a bet on Unlock Aid and sort of backing out the expected value of turning, $40 billion a year of U.S. development dollars into something that's like radically more effective than what the, development primes are able to deliver seems like a pretty straightforward case to me. So anyways, that's my sort of unsponsored pitch for supporting Unlock Aid.
Well, thank you, Jordan. We think there are reasons to believe this is achievable. First, in the most recent omnibus bill, Congress increased 33% funding for the most effective unit inside of USAID that delivers a social return on investment of 17 to 1 by 33%. We just saw the agency publish its acquisitions and assistance plan, which will govern how the agency spends $100 billion over the next 5 years. And they chose 4 indicators that will govern how they're going to spend money as the main things they want to use to track progress. 2 of them related to diversifying who the agency works with. 2 of them related to paying for performance. We just saw the introduction of legislation that will direct USAID to prioritize its investments towards its most cost-effective, highest impact interventions. So there's a lot of things that are happening right now that give us the sense that we have reasons to believe that change is possible, which is why the next 18 months are going to be so crucial to drive this campaign over the finish line to make sure that we can pass landmark legislation that fundamentally reforms the way that we do U.S. foreign aid, positions the United States as the partner of first resort for countries around the world, and ultimately gets more resources to organizations best positioned to save lives, have an impact.
So what does quadrupling your Unlock Aid's budget unlock?
So I think the first thing is that so often the challenge is a literacy one. When people are talking about foreign aid reform and procurement challenges, these can feel like very insider, esoteric topics. But when we actually have the moment to talk to a lawmaker, help them understand how very simple fixes can unlock billions of dollars for a greater impact, we very quickly bring them into the conversation and they're excited about the possibility for change. So the first thing is more resources would enable us to have more of those conversations. But right now, we're limited in terms of how many conversations the handful of us that are on the full-time staff of Unlock Aid can do. So first, more resources enable us to have significantly increase the literacy and education that we're able to do with lawmakers. The second, I think the other thing is we need to do a better job of telling the stories of what we're missing out on. You look out across Africa, Asia, Latin America, there are organizations that are transforming those countries' economies for good. And right now we have too antiquated, anachronistic idea of what the capabilities of African organizations, Latin American organizations, Asian organizations are. We need to do a better job of telling the stories of change makers who are using next generation technologies to solve hard problems and showing what's possible. And so more resources would also help us do a better job of connecting those stories with impact to help people see that better funding flows could really accelerate our ability to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, meet climate targets, and ultimately save more lives.
I would say along the lines of any campaign, and that's really our core orientation this year is treating this like everyday matters to kind of the goal line at the end of this administration. Did we make significant changes in terms of new legislation, new policies enacted by USAID, ultimately implementation on the ground of some new solutions that innovators are leading. early funding matters. And so being able to have funding in the door now that allows us to hire the resources, building out the team, the additional work we need from a digital perspective to be able to really also break out this conversation beyond Washington, D.C. So much of the conversation around foreign aid, around global development is happening in an echo chamber in Washington, D.C. I think we like to think that Americans at large are not really thinking about this, but they are thinking about this, right? They're thinking about it in terms of how the global supply chain shutdown impacted their day-to-day lives. And we need to do a better job of connecting, what's going on day-to-day across America with foreign aid spending. And so being able to do that narrative shift work in terms of how we're reaching this into new audiences is a critical part of the funding, where the funding will go to be able to build more bridges to connecting this conversation with audiences.
I think the other sort of interesting like extension is, you alluded to it earlier, Walter, about how these procurement problems aren't sort of foreign aid specific, and how, spending money more thoughtfully with smaller dollar amounts in a more sort of like, where you push the decision making down, or what have you. This is like a every federal agency, I'm sure, has a variant of it, and the extent you guys can like have your like alliance be across. Well, actually, I don't know if that'll get you closer to success, but that's a
One of the things that I find to be really interesting about a conversation with lawmakers is that it's really a roll of the dice sometimes about how the conversation is going to go. The meeting might start, and when we're talking about foreign aid spending, you might have somebody who's very concerned about cost effectiveness and making sure that we're getting, high yield for every dollar spent. You might have somebody that cares deeply about how much money is actually reaching local communities, how many lives saved, or coming at this from the perspective of just, are we saving lives? You might have somebody that's coming at this from the perspective of, is the United States showing up as a responsible global leader, especially in the context of China, which takes on a whole other conversation with so many in Congress. The thing that's interesting about all three of these conversations, no matter which perspective you're coming at, is that they all kind of boil down to the same sets of issues around procurement challenges, procurement reform, creating new pathways for organizations to be able to access funding, making sure that we're prioritizing investments for those interventions and solutions that we know will work. So there's actually, we're finding broad-based bipartisan support for a reform package to improve the way that we administer foreign aid every year, because the better that we spend this money abroad, ultimately improves also our interests here at home. And so we are finding that there's growing appetite for this issue. And to your question earlier about what would more resources do for us, I think the more that we're able to get this message out to constituencies and lawmakers to help them understand why this issue matters so much would be a major unlock for us.
And Jordan, I was reflecting back at the beginning of the discussion when you mentioned the term think tank in regards to Unlock Aid. I think this is another area where there's almost an innovation in how we operate. And that another thing I think we feel that resonates really well with legislators is that not only are we coming up with the new ideas, but there's a circular aspect of being able to reference those from the frontline innovators, the doers, and then we also have the advocacy. So I think in many ways, we're an innovation in ourselves in terms of how we're trying to drive this reform, and that we're the ideas, we're also the doers, and then we're also doing the advocacy, and kind of having that in one place is I think, kind of a key part of our momentum today with legislators.
Maybe, Walter, one question for you. So, this is like the sort of possibility space that you are now operating with, as compared to your time as an FSO doing China stuff, is like radically different. I'm curious kind of how you have like made the mental shift from like cog in the machine to like trying to change the machine.
Yeah, well, I think that at the root of all of this, whether it's working on the inside as a foreign service officer or being on the outside, working with Amanda and others to kind of agitate for reform, I think what underpins all of this is a deep belief in the potential of government to deliver. I think for what it's worth, at the State Department, you actually get a really high ROI for every dollar that goes into that agency, just in terms of the programs that we're able to administer, the kinds of conversations that we're able to have with other countries to inspire trust. So So much of what the motivation behind Unlock 8 is about how do we get every federal government agency to deliver, and we are starting with U.S. foreign aid agencies. There's a role for both to play. I mean, when you think about both, there's a role for both insiders and outsiders to play. When you think about what's required for policy change, you do need people on the outside who are fighting for new authorities, who are fighting for new legislation. But you also need people on the inside who are committed to reform too, because legislation only matters, bills only matter if you have people who are willing to then be good implementers of those things. So there's a role for reformers to play inside or outside of government. And I think just the constraints that you're dealing with are slightly different depending on the perspective you're taking.
Sort of like a tangent to close on, Walter. You were there in the bad old days of China Substack. I think it was like me, you, and Bill Bishop for a few years. You ran the Chinese Journal Review, where every few weeks or so you would like read some random stuff on CNKI and write about interesting papers that you found Chinese academics were writing. And, we're at a bit of an end of an era. I think just yesterday, CNKI announced that it would no longer be allowing foreigners to access Chinese journal articles. Any thoughts or reflections on that experience now that, we're really hitting a different, we're really in a different moment when it comes to the ways in which Chinese academics can engage with the rest of the world?
Well, first of all, to put the Chinese Journal Review in the same league as ChinaTalk and cynicism is very generous, but thank you. I think that, well, obviously, China restricting who can even access CNKI anymore is a huge blow. One, I think the other thing though is that with ChatGPT-4, I'm not convinced that there is I look at how many hours I spent trying to go through Chinese white papers, translating and then summarizing them and thinking about how much more you could potentially do just with today's technology. Even putting aside China restricting who can access CNKI or not, there was already, I think, a real shift that you could see in terms of even the quality of papers, research that you could even find on CNKI. The reach of the government in terms of how much people felt comfortable publishing, what kinds of insights they felt like they could put on CNKI, I think was already becoming apparent. That you're getting more and more sanitized documents, fewer and fewer original ideas that really challenged orthodoxy thinking. But obviously China restricting access to, its premier kind of JSTOR-like database is a big blow.
Walter and Amanda, thanks so much for being a part of China.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks, Jordan. Really appreciate it.
又非是不可，没营养的标题停着在位，看得很累。想法一言不合，只要你敢最白的说成黑，懒得再变。旁边悠哉的家长，小孩在闹，手机拼命滑，这个刚变绿灯啊，不可不停急着投胎嘛。前面奥克在找茬，是以为花钱就是老大，房东太太又涨价，我压力山大。大哥，你睡醒了吗？送掉你敢扣掉啊？玩够了吗？请问你是哪位啦？拜托你安静一下。玩够了吗？好了啦，好了啦，拜托别再乱啦。好了啦，好了啦，龙妹拍谁？你在那边回？在那边回。要自救还是靠比赛？快点决定，马路当你家。雄厚你上把追赶，准备插队当我说教吗？有人才喝几杯下，是口大饮酒品是多差，真的快疯了，到底我原地爆炸。大哥，你睡醒了吗？送掉你敢扣掉啊？玩够了吗？请问你是哪位啦？拜 拜托你安静一下，玩够了吗？好了啦，好了啦，拜托别再乱啦。好了啦，好了啦，龙妹拍谁？你在那边挥？在那边挥？在那边挥？在那边挥？好了啦，在那边挥？